Good morning to you. It's Friday morning. Welcome to the Vicarage. Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us for today. Just to remind you, as I have done the last few days, that next week we're going to start something different. Monday morning, we're finishing as much as we're going to do of Luke's Gospel with a very, very interesting reading about who Jesus is next Monday. Really, really interesting reading next Monday. And as from that, for the next few weeks, we're having a foray into the Old Testament. And some of my colleagues here are going to give us some thoughts about the prophet Isaiah for about 3 or 4 weeks. A fascinating book. When you hear it, you'll recognise lots of it when you hear it from things like Christmas services, that kind of thing. But anyway, starting next Tuesday, we are starting a whole series of talks about Isaiah, so do enjoy those as well. But for today, we are in the Gospel of Luke, and it's chapter 9, and we're starting to read now at verse 12. Here goes. The day was drawing to a close, and the 12 came to Jesus and said, "Send the crowd away, so they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a deserted place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, before we get into the kind of the juicy text, and it's just wow, a few just thoughts about this particular reading. It's because it's quite unusual. This famous feeding of the 5,000. Firstly, because it's the only Galilean miracle. Yes, it's the only Galilean miracle which is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You get quite a few that are mentioned in 1 or 2 of them. But it's unique in it's the only miracle in Galilee, anyway, that Jesus did, which is mentioned in all 4 Gospels, which kind of says something that is really, really important. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have it. All with slightly different nuances, but nonetheless, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It's also interesting because it's pretty much the only miracle which is thought to have taken place pretty much twice. In the Gospel of Mark, you hear that on one occasion, he feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. On another occasion, shortly afterwards, almost to make sure it wasn't an accident, he feeds 4,000 people with, I think it's 7 bits of bread and lots of bits of fish or something like that. Okay, it's unique in a sense. Sorry, because he seems to kind of do it twice. That's the second amazing thing about this. Another amazing thing about it is there's not so much about the crowd here. Most miracles, you get some kind of reaction. You know, people were amazed or astonished or they were angry or something. There's almost no reaction here mentioned at all, which I think is interesting. It's also interesting because in recent years, not so much recently, but about 30, 40 years ago, all manner of explanations were given to try and explain this one away. It was said by some that, you know, Jesus had a kind of a secret stash of food hidden in a cave round the corner, which he brought out. Another suggestion was that by getting someone to share meant everywhere else started sharing their lunchboxes, which is a kind of lovely idea, but in reality it's a bit silly. The text is very clear. It's Jesus has performed a miracle here, and the text is very, very clear about that. And to try and twist it round, to try and explain by miracles is frankly, in my humble opinion, a bit silly. So, here we have Jesus in the desert feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, there are hundreds, thousands. I mean, this reading is so rammed full of meaning, I just don't really know where to start. But I'm just going to focus on a couple of really kind of broad, sweep things this morning, kind of big themes, which can kind of get your imagination going. I hope you can stimulate your brains to kind of think a bit more about this. Firstly, this. When we started doing my Luke's Gospel, I said one of the great themes in the Gospel of Luke is that things start small, very small, and get very, very big. So you get parables like the mustard seed, which start with the smallest seed, becomes the biggest tree. You have it starts off with a word by an angel to a young woman in Nazareth, suddenly becomes 12 people, becomes a crowd, 5,000 here, becomes a big movement, which kind of gets small when Jesus dies, then grows to the ends of the earth in the book of Acts. So you get this constant theme of things that are very small becoming absolutely massive. And actually, you have that abundantly clear in our reading for this morning. Hear the language Luke uses. If you want to interpret Luke, look for the blindingly obvious. Think of the food here. It starts off with a massive need. You've got 5,000 hungry people, and all they've got is 5 little bits of bread and 2 little bits of pickled fish, and that's all they've got. So you've got a massive, massive need with lots and lots of people and a tiny. But in Jesus, this tiny, tiny bits of food gets broken and given, and all of a sudden, hear the language. You know, how many people are fed? This isn't just a family here who've made do. This is 5,000 people, and I forget which gospel. I think it's John. Says that's just the men, besides the women and the children. So we are talking about this tiny, tiny bit of bread. Starts small, and what does it feed? It feeds 5,000 people. You know, it's a tiny, tiny thing. Becomes an absolute abundance of people. And notice they didn't just have enough to keep them going. They were satisfied. So this massive, imagine 5,000 people. That's half the population of Penn being fed, you know, and not just fed, but satisfied. And beyond even that, there's scraps left on the ground, and he picks them up, and 12 baskets from the bits that are picked up, you know. And I think what, again, Luke is trying to say very, very clearly is that something that starts very, very small in God becomes absolutely massive. And again, it's not just, this isn't the language of austerity. This isn't the language of just enough, you know. This isn't just, if you like, our daily bread. We are talking super abundant. We're talking, as I say, about a massive, but these tiny, because a massive crowd, you know, 5,000, that's a lot of people. And they weren't just given enough, they were satisfied. And wasn't just that, there was 12 baskets left over from the bits on the ground. The picture you're getting is that something that starts very, very small in Jesus becomes very, very massive. You get this theme here of very, very small becoming very, very large. And not just very, very large, but large and abundant. And again, it's the thing that you get all the way through. So, you know, so when Jesus does water into wine, it's kind of super abundant quantities. So that's the first big theme I want you to get your imagination around here, is that in God, in Jesus, things that start very, very small become very, very large. And let's let our faith, let our imagination reflect and have with awe and wonder on what a wonderful, superabundant God we have. That's the first big theme. So the first big theme is things starting small, becoming big and abundant in Jesus. Let's just hear that. Let's let our faith hear that. And let's let our faith be fed by that. The other thing, which I think is huge, is that this reading, probably as much as any, shows kind of the fancy theological word is eschatological side of Jesus. This feeding miracle here reminds us of feeding in other times. So firstly, it looks back and it looks forward, okay? So it looks back to days in the Old Testament when, into Passover meals, you know, when it reminds us of God freeing his people from Egypt. So it reminds us of the Passover meal when the person at the host of the feast takes bread, gives thanks, breaks it and gives it. So it reminds us of that. So it reminds us of God's great liberation. Okay. Secondly, it reminds us also of here it's called a deserted place. It means a desert place is the Greek. Reminds us again when the people of God, they were given freedom and they crossed the desert, and God fed his people with manna in the desert. He's hungry people who were desperate, and he fed them with bread in the wilderness. How would the Welsh hymn put it? Feed me now and evermore. You know. So you've got it. So it looks back to Passover meals and God's liberation and God's freedom. It also looks back to another meal in the desert when God fed his people when they were hungry. But it also looks forward. Notice the language that's used by Luke here, what Jesus does with the bread. He takes it, he gives thanks for it, blessed it, he breaks it, and he gives it. Exactly the same language that's used in the Last Supper, the last night before Jesus died. It looks forward to that, when Jesus would break bread to remind us, do this, he says, to remember me. So he looks forward to that. But it also looks forward to the great feast there's going to be in heaven one day, that great heavenly banquet, as the prayer book puts it, prepared for everybody. They will look forward to heaven, place where there'll be no more death, no more crying, and ultimate victory in Jesus. So this feeding of the 5,000, the language he uses shows that it looks back to God's setting his people free, God's liberation from slavery. It looks back also to God feeding his people as they go through the desert. It also looks forward to the time when Jesus would break bread with his disciples to remember me the night before he died. And it also looks forward to the heavenly banquet as well. And that's one of the reasons I think this reading is so good. This heavenly feast, this feast in the desert with the people, looks back and looks forward, reminding us that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that God is liberating, God is feeding, God is saving, and God is blessing, and God is rescuing, and God's with us. So there's masses in this feeding of 5,000. I could bang on about it for days. We could make a long weekend. But just two broad sweep things for you this morning. Firstly, here again this theme of things that start very small, becoming massive in Jesus. And let's let your faith enjoy that, and let's let our faith value that and hear that. And I think the second thing is Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And this story looks back to God's liberation, God's provision. It also looks forward to God's salvation and God's victory. And we have it all here. No wonder Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record it. Have a lovely weekend. Hope that makes sense. God bless you, and I'll speak to you. I'll be around over the weekend. And Monday, it's the last bit we're going to do on Luke, and then we're into Isaiah.